Hi, and welcome to Just Nation, the show about social justice issues in Philadelphia. My name is Nia Holston. I am your co-host on Just Nation, and we're so glad to have you here for what is going to be such an important and impactful conversation between two media people in Philadelphia. And so I'm going to let my co-host introduce himself today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Reverend Gregory Holston. Just so excited to be again with you on these conversations that we have. And thank you for inviting us into your home to be able to share issues of faith, justice, and race in the city of Philadelphia and beyond. And so we're excited with our guest here today. And I'm going to start to my right. If you would introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Cassie Owens. I'm happy to be here. I'm News Voices Philadelphia Program Manager at Free Press. Free Press is a nonprofit that is headquartered in DC that takes on issues of media injustice and working to have better and more equitable media systems in our country. And also, I specifically work on a project that is about bringing together community and journalists to transform crime coverage so that it's more in alignment with community information needs and that we can reduce the harm that's coming every day from the way that the coverage is made.
Excellent, excellent. And our other guest, who is not in studio today, a good friend of mine, Amadi Braxton. Why don't you say hello to our audience today, Amadi?
Hello, everyone. My name is Amadi Braxton, and I am a consultant working in social movement and social justice spaces with supporting organizations to make social change happen. And I'm also host of the Solutions Show on WURD Radio. It is a progressive, independent, Black-owned radio station, media company. And on the show, we try to lift up the voices of advocates, activists, elected officials, and change makers who are trying to highlight solutions to the problems that we're facing every day here in Philadelphia, but also nationally and globally. So I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So just to kick it off, so Cassie, I'm very, very interested in what you described about working with communities to make sure crime coverage is in line with community needs. So can you share a little bit about how crime coverage traditionally has not been in line with community needs and how you're working to make it so that is the case?
Sure. I mean, one of the things about crime coverage is that very few people like it. Even journalists do not like it. There are so many times where there's a crime brief or just a quick crime story, a quick spot on the news that we see that it might make us feel anxiety, it might make us feel unsafe, but it doesn't actually give us the tools that we need to be better able to civically engage around what happened. It doesn't give us information that's geared around solutions. It doesn't give us information that gives us the pathways from a public health or from an epidemiological perspective to be able to understand the crises that we're living through every single day collectively. Whether you are impacted by gun violence or impacted by certain forms of crime or not, the narratives that surround those incidents in this city absolutely impact policy and absolutely impacts where our tax dollars go. So what we're trying to do is to actually denormalize some of the things that come along with producing crime coverage. And we're also trying to center Black and brown folks who are interested in either creating or supporting media and news projects that don't aspire to necessarily be crime coverage, but aspire to be public safety coverage that actually will give us information about public safety that can perhaps actually encourage better public safety that is community-led and community-centered.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So when you're describing this work, I think it's helpful to provide detail about like what it is we're talking about. And everybody's seen the news shows that have talked about, if it bleeds, it leads, and have seen crime coverage related to shootings or related to violence in the community. So is that sort of what you're describing?
Absolutely.
Okay, got it. Amadi, do you have any thoughts on what Cassie just shared?
Sure. When I was listening to you, Cassie, I was thinking about, I also do some kind of work in the sphere of somatics. And so when we are seeing violence depicted in news coverage, or we're hearing about violent crime that has happened or shootings that have happened, we have a physical somatic reaction in our bodies. We have anxiety, we have sometimes fear, but when we have those things, they actually have a chemical reaction in our body. And anxiety can create a fight, flight, or freeze response. And when you're sitting in front of your television, oftentimes you have a freeze response. So you feel incapacitated. You feel like there's nothing you can do. Feel like there's nothing that can be done in the way that this kind of coverage is typically shared. And I agree with Cassie in terms of, the need to really cover these issues by looking at what is the root cause and what can be done to alleviate the circumstances that lead to crimes of violence and, shootings and things like that. But it seems like the way the media has traditionally portrayed these things, it is about spurring fear. In a way, the effect is sowing division in communities because, we're portraying a certain set of people as being the ones who are more criminal, quote unquote. And it creates a freeze response in those of us who are watching. And it also, for those who may not look like those who are being depicted as the criminals, quote unquote, it creates a division and a separation. Like those people are doing these things. Those people are the ones with the problem, those communities. And it does not implicate or connect viewers who may not have the same skin color, that this is actually a broader community problem that we all have a stake in making better.
I was thinking in the conversation about the violence that people see from pretty much the first 15 minutes of newscast every day. And now other sources, of course, as well. And newscast didn't used to be that way. Out of all our disciplines, history is best to reward our research. So if we look back at history, we recognize that it really was in Philadelphia, Action News, that became the model for the nation in how to make media profitable and make media not just profitable, extremely wealthy. Before then, it was basically a 15-minute newscast where John Facenda would come on here in Philadelphia, and they would talk about what was going on in the city council, what was going on in the mayor's office, what was the major issues they were trying to address for the city. Channel 6, looking for people, decided to focus on violence and put that first in the newscast. It drew so many people. And that station has been #1 ever since because of the extreme violence that they put on in the first 15 minutes. And again, my question, I guess, in all of what I just said was, isn't the money in media going to make change really difficult in terms of what you're talking about?
I think absolutely. And thank you for sharing that history, and wanted to lift up that there's a really fantastic article and short documentary that the Philadelphia Inquirer published by Layla A. Jones that delves into all of that. Something that I think that we have to ask ourselves as a society is, why are images of violence, especially violence against certain communities, especially violence against Black people, especially violence against hyper-vulnerable people, why are depictions of those things so profitable? It's not simply profitable in news. We have a media ecosystem where we are consistently consuming images of violence that will give us all of the feelings that Amity just spoke to. We're seeing it in the crime shows. We're seeing it in video games. We're seeing it in music. We're seeing it in so many different sectors of how we consume information and visuals. That it's very much a part of our endemic to actually be consuming information that not only desensitizes us to the violence that we're bearing witness to, but that also can actually, and frequently does, exacerbate violence and increases more cycles of violence. I think that one of the things that is important to remember is that while the "if it bleeds, it leads" format was absolutely born in Philadelphia at Action News, that narratives that actually would portray Black people as brutish and violent had been very popular for many political reasons for centuries before then, before the United States was even a country. And that is a tradition in news that has always had a relationship to commerce, has always had a relationship to advertising, has always had a relationship to narratives around what safety is and who should be safe in America. I want to lift up the work of my colleague Joe Torres at Free Press from Media 2070. They do a lot of incredible work around media reparations and have been lifting up a lot of powerful history. But, you know, if Joe was here, he might talk about how so many of our newspapers economically were built on slave advertisements. And
See, that's one of them church moments that we hear. And you know exactly what I'm saying. I don't have to say anything.
yeah,
But
yeah. And Joe, he actually told me about this book that I brought here today because I figured it might be relevant to our conversation, Debating the Issues in Colonial Newspapers by David A. Copeland. And just going to read a paragraph from it. News of slave insurrections and slave crimes was some of the most repeated information in newspapers. Repetition of news suggests its importance to readers, and in the case of news about slaves, it implies a fear on the part of whites of those blacks in servitude. In 1755, for example, a slave in Kittery, now in Maine, but then a part of Massachusetts, murdered the child of his master because the owner had admonished the slave in public. The news of the tragedy was reported in 8 newspapers. Newspapers printed all sorts of reports of brutal crimes by slaves, attempted crimes, revolts, and attempted revolts. Innuendo about slave activity was sometimes all that was needed to produce a news story that created panic among the white population. Often the activities of blacks were referred to in newspapers as the proceedings of the rebellious Negroes.
Okay.
So wanted to take a moment and name that a lot of the language that is in this book is not necessarily the most human first and most dignified language. So if anyone has sensitivity or has difficulty hearing the term slave, please know that there are folks who understand that our ancestors were enslaved. And with that said, the narratives really go back that far, and those narratives were able to run amok before journalism as a field was standardized with its own ethics system. So it was completely bonded with what yellow journalism, as you might understand,
Can explain yellow journalism for the audience?
Yellow journalism is a term that is typically used around journalism that came in the early 1900s that was rich with sensationalism, with caricatures, exaggerations, distortions, and propaganda. And I don't think that something that we always understand contemporarily is that that type of sensationalism was older than that. And that in the 19th century in the US, it was very common for people to publish fake stories about Black people being violent.
What do you mean? You mean there was fake news?
Fake news back then. So, yes.
Yeah, yeah. You really gave a great historical overview of how of really what we have known. We've always known that the subjugation of Black folks, the attempts to quell Black resistance are profitable, and the fear of Black people has been a consistent thread before the founding of this country, right? And so I thank you for that historical overview. I want to kind of ask, and I want to kind of like spell it out for our viewerships. What we're talking about here is really that the impact of the media, the impact of media narratives and sensationalism and crime has had a tangible impact on mass incarceration and the continued subjugation of Black folks, the continued incarceration of Black folks, the continued lack of resources that are present within our communities. So I want to just ask you, ask both of you about that and how you've seen that play out, in terms of policies that have been generated, and how that's still playing out today. Yeah, so Amadi, if you want to start.
Sure. You know, to me, I'm 53 years old. I grew up during the beginning of the war on drugs, and to me, the war on drugs and the media narrative that accompanied that, the constant depictions of Black people as criminals, constant images of young Black men in particular being arrested, being hauled off in handcuffs, doing the perp walk, as they say, images of drug busts going on. All of that was throughout my childhood. And that has a direct relationship to policies, the war on drugs policies that have come about, that came about in that era. 3 strikes, you're out. All of these very punitive, particularly here in the state of Pennsylvania and here in Philadelphia under DA Lynn Abraham, you know, that just was kind of like the media portrayal of Black people as criminal, as always suspect, really fueled the mass incarceration movement in the criminal justice system here in this city for decades, which is why we have such high rates of incarceration here in Pennsylvania. And so to me, there's a direct relationship with that portrayal. Again, the racialized portrayal of Black people as criminal and as suspect really has a direct correlation to those kinds of policies.
Absolutely, and the intentional nature. I mean, that this was an intentional practice. To lead to all of the mass incarceration that we're talking about today, I'm reminded that the war on drugs was an intentional racist practice. That redlining was an intentional racist practice. All of these practices, so this particular practice as well, is structural racism in the media. So on Action News, when we say Action News, you're racist, it is because of this legacy and history, this lineage that you are adopting into the way you do what you do, and you think you're doing it just because we're just covering the news that we see and not being tied to the history that has created the conditions.
Well, I'll just add really quickly because I fully agree with everything that was said, that an example that has a real local connection is the term super predators, which was popularized by a Penn professor and then caught wild in so many of the narratives of the 1990s. And I think that something that you know, like when we talk about the lifespan of like a deeply harmful narrative like that, right? And we think about during, you know, 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running for office, and the ways that Bill Clinton was actually in Philadelphia confronted over that language. I think that it's something that it's never something that is harmful in just one story. It's something that has a real life cycle of harm that changes the way that we can engage and understand our politics.
Thank you for that that specific example. One thing I will also say, you know, just to kind of make it plain, what we're talking about is the use of the media to sensationalize crime, to create policies that are racist, that have draconian, disproportionate, terrible outcomes on Black people. That doesn't mean that the face of those policies are always not Black people, right? In fact, in many instances, they are Black people, because in the ways that both of our guests have talked about tonight, the capitalist system that we are living under benefits from Black suffering, Black pain, Black trauma, right? And so I think, make no mistake, that there can be a Black politician or a Black policymaker, and there have been many that have been in support of these narratives that have had this harmful effect on our communities. So I want to just...
And can I just mention,
Yes.
there's a book about that called Locking Up Our Own by James Orman, who talks about the role that Black people have played in the height of the war on drugs, tough on crime, you know, fever or fervor, that Black people have played a role in encouraging mass incarceration, encouraging punitive solutions to social issues within our community. So I just wanted to lift that up for anybody listening who might want to check that book out, Locking Up Our Own.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to transition just a little bit. I just want to, you know, talk with you both about what are some of the biggest problems that you're seeing with today's media, whether that be sort of more mainstream media news outlets, whether that be social media. What, from your perspective, is just the thing that really grates you the most?
I think that, like, there's a lot of huge problems, and if I had to pick one that, like, I think about a lot, is basically the systems that we hold around ethics with media and with publication, broadcasting, streaming, the whole bit. I think that if we can, you know, like, I think in a lot of conversations we measure up media that individuals make or that certain communities make without as many resources on social media. And measure that up and say, hey, this doesn't have, you know, the whole ethical system around verification and a number of different standards that status quo journalism might have. But at the same time, if we can see that the most robust ethical systems that are lifted up regularly when it comes to news and information, if those ethical systems were forged during a time when it didn't actually have to be ethical to anyone who wasn't white, and didn't have to be accountable to anyone who wasn't white, then, you know, like, we don't have a good measure of what a collective, like, ethical practice around media in this country for a multicultural society. We've never had it. It's not something that has been practiced en masse. And I think something that is tough is that while there are a lot of things that we have going that are a lot of bright spots to bring better practices and better ethics into media production, we also have a lot of folks who aren't being supported in developing their own ethical systems for publication and broadcasting in particular. So people lean into interpersonal dynamics, interpersonal ethics, and they might have fantastic interpersonal ethics, but it might not actually be the ethics that is going to ask you the questions of, do you put the name of this 17-year-old in something that 100,000 people can see? And so I think that there's a real need for new ethical systems, new ethical standards that actually would serve the communities that the information is serving.
Yeah.
Powerful,
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah, yeah.
And thank you for the example, because I was going to ask, you talked ethical standards, so like, well, we'll give one for us. And the one about whether to use the 17-year-old's name, and how what is the context of that? And that these ethical standards were produced in a time where black people weren't involved in producing them, so they're by inherently racist, because we did not create those standards. We didn't participate in those standards.
Yeah.
And that's how, when we talk about structural racism, that is exactly one of the things that happens. People get these sets of standards, these sets of rules, these sets of ways of doing things, and they say, I'm just doing what I've always done. This is the way the rules are. But if black folk weren't there to create the rules are inherently racist. And that means a dismantling of the systems. And the ethical standards are one of those systems. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. Amadi, do you want to share about some of the problems as you see it?
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the big problems, which may seem obvious, is just lack of diversity of voices covering these issues. And this relates to what Cassie was just saying. But just, I think media is doing better, like mainstream media is trying to do better in terms of diversifying, but there's still quite a long way to go in terms of getting more black people in newsrooms, getting more, people of color generally in newsrooms to actually cover the stories, because they can bring a context, a cultural context and understanding that other people can't bring. And I think, when I see even the coverage of, a lot of these campus encampment protests around Gaza, or whether it be coverage of, everyday things happening in the community related to housing or related to, other issues. If you don't have people who have some experience with that, or some lived experience, I think there is a deficit or a gap in terms of how they can interpret what's happening and then portray it to the general public. So that's one of the kind of basic things I see as lack of diversity. I think, again, that is changing. I like seeing also there's a growing movement around having more independent nonprofit, publications out there that are doing more kind of grassroots reporting, but I think we need a lot more of that.
Yeah, definitely. And it is, you brought up the student protests in Gaza about Palestine solidarity. You brought that up, and you really do see in that example how even when it's, white, college-aged students who are supposed to be the most safe, because they are not serving like particular aims, there's certain narratives are created, and I do think it is especially timely to think about how that was created in terms of creating narratives. They're dangerous. These encampments are unsafe. They are making other people feel unsafe. They are violent in particular, and so how that idea of violence is then used and wielded against anyone who's speaking up against the particular ruling class. And so I'm glad you brought that up. I did want to ask a little bit of just kind of changing subjects. One of the problems that I see just as a reader of journalism is that there's so much journalism that's behind a paywall. And we've talked about the reasons why that journalism, some of that journalism may not be quality journalism, may not have the sort of ethical standards that we would want them to have, that may be engaging in sensationalization of crime, right? We've talked about that. But also, you know, on the flip side, you know, in terms of getting access to information, in terms of getting useful resources, I know for myself, there's a lot of information that I get, not necessarily about what's going on in the world, but how I can make my individual life better, like how I can take care of my health, the resources that are out there in my community that are specifically from articles that are coming from traditional media outlets. But if you are not able to get access to those because you can't afford a $10 a month subscription, a $20 a month subscription, what does that mean? It looks very different than even how it looked 20, 30 years ago. And so I just wanted to, you know, kind of hear the problem from both of your perspectives, and to sort of share how that happened, you know, where the price of media has just become much more expensive, save for talking about media that's available on social media and then from the independent media outlets. But if you could just share a little bit about that, I think that would be great. And maybe Amadi, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, I think a lot of people are turning to free sources of media because they maybe can't afford or don't even know that there's other sources out there. So I know a lot of people who get their news from Facebook or who get their news from, you know, Instagram. And part of the problem with that, and this isn't necessarily speaking to exactly your question, but it dawned on me as you're speaking that part of the problem with that is that, you know, these media companies, these social media companies, I should say, are actually not regulated for, you know, a standard of not disseminating fake news. So we've seen that they're not treated as news outlets, even though a lot of people get their news from there. And people are, you know, getting information that is not necessarily the best information, not necessarily the most useful. And also because our schools aren't necessarily teaching critical literacy skills on how to, or critical media skills in terms of how to discern what is useful information, what is not useful information, how can you spot information that might be false or faulty or unreliable. Those skills aren't being taught anymore, it seems. So I think we have a problem with people accessing information sometimes from free news sources that isn't necessarily giving people accurate, good information, but there's no discernment about, is this fake? Is it entertainment? Is it, you know, is it actual newsworthy information? There's all of those things are kind of blurred together in a social media and climate, and there's really no regulation by our government of any of those sources. Not to mention that, you know, people's data and information is being collected willy-nilly without our permission. So, you know, I see that as a big problem. But I think, you know, we do need more people to have more access to community-based, community-produced information, news, media that is actually speaking to the realities and the needs and interests that are actually going to serve them and benefit and improve their lives.
Absolutely. Cassie?
Yes, one of the things that is so rich about the dynamics that we're dealing with media is that some of the stuff that we're dealing with is really old, and then some of the stuff that we're dealing with is not that old. Paywalls are not that old. Paywalls really got started in like the 90s, the mid to late 90s, as, you know, news sites were figuring out the business of being online. And a lot of the first paywalls in the US were from websites and news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and Slate and Salon and the New York Times. One of the things that I think is a real challenge for local news sites, is that, that paywall model and that subscription model and those early models that inspired other news sites with how they would organize their paywalls and become an industry standard and become industry standards, that those were actually sites that served national audiences and had, their own brand identities within those national audiences to appeal to particular swaths. I think that a lot of people, when they consume the Wall Street Journal, are expecting to see something that is a little bit right of center, that's going to be covering a particular coverage area. The New York Times had a brand identity where they were for curious people, no matter where they were. When you have a local news site, you're taking, a paywall model when your audience is not supposed to be a particular swath of that community. Your audience is supposed to be the community. And so there's, from my perspective, there's a mismatch in the model, just like starting out. I also think that something that my colleague Tim Carr would lift up is that, paid TV is about 40 years old. There's a real problem in our society that we so quickly expect information that is so vital to our lives to be something that we pay for, when there were lots and lots and lots of examples and continue to be examples of people being able to share that information freely.
I think that's so true. I mean, this program is on cable access, so that's something they had to do by law when they got the cable license, and create this Philly Cam where we're at right now. But if you don't have the money to pay for the cable, you can't even get this kind of information. And that paywall, the idea you got to pay TV, now you got to pay here, you got to pay for basic knowledge of citizenship of your community. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And do we want people to be better citizens? Do we want to teach civics? Do we want to be able to have more greater participation? Maybe the voter participation going down is a direct result of having to pay access to information that will give you a greater understanding of the democracy that we supposedly live in. So there's some direct relationship between that paywall model and a model of a lower participation in elections. And so I think that's interesting, but also I think about, what Amadi said about the is democratization of information, which means you have fake stuff and real stuff and being able to discern all that. Is that been good for us, or has that not been good for us? And so I thought I'd ask the question back to Amadi first, because she brought it up. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think, upsides is that it has given us the opportunity for people to share real, things that are happening in real life, and creating viral moments where we get to see things, and the whole country or whole world gets to see something happening that would normally never be seen. For example, incidents of police brutality, and things like that, which have gotten so much more exposure since with the advent of, mobile phone technology that can actually film things, and then you can put it on the internet very quickly. Things like that have exposed and opened the world's eyes to practices of police misconduct in this country. And in some ways, that is a very good thing, because we're getting this kind of exposure to the realities of our lives that we never got before. But I think, there's downsides in terms of how social media companies in particular, but I think this is probably, and Cassie may know more about this than I, but, are able to, put disinformation and misinformation out there, gather people's data in terms of their viewing habits, plug it into algorithms, and target people with advertising and information to kind of, get them excited to get again, that somatic bodily response out of them. And that kind of cycle perpetuates certain kinds of messages and information being targeted towards certain people that limits their vision of what is actually happening and what is actually reality. So I think that is the dangerous side of the social media landscape that we're in now, because we're not controlling it. It's being controlled by these corporations that are run by people who don't look like us, that are being run by billionaires, and there's no accountability. But they're the biggest games in town, and they've captured our imaginations early on, and they're continuing to keep us engaged in things that they want us to be engaged in versus actually what would be helpful for us to be engaged in. And again, it's all based on that getting a reaction and a rise out of people. That is what is considered newsworthy or the thing that keeps people's attention. And to me, that is not healthy for our communities.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think that the democratization of media is a good thing, but I think that in a lot of contexts we're seeing the friction from having media systems that weren't necessarily designed to be democratic. And I think that, for example, if we're talking about just like the stark differences between the ways that different sectors within media are covering what's happening in Gaza, I think that's a really good example of how there are not just a lot of narratives that have disparities between them and how they're being presented, but that they're literally in open competition and changing the way that we talk about this, and talking also the way that it's being spoken about in Congress. I think that we need to be able to invest more in spaces like the space that we're in right now, like Philly Cam.
I like that.
Community media,
Yes.
civic media, because like it shouldn't actually be our reality that there's such a high bar to be a media maker that has, all of the support and infrastructure to get narratives out more widely. But it also shouldn't be the case that the algorithms that Amadi was speaking to, that so many of the larger systems within social media and within how the internet functions are not controlled democratically. They are controlled by private industry that does not have any obligation to align that with public service.
So is that really a false term then? Democratization of social media and all? Is it really democracy then?
I think that it's democracy perhaps for the people who are doing it, right? Like I think that everybody who is involved right now with this show is doing a really powerful civic action, a really powerful democratic action. I think that, like America is always in tension over what democracy is.
That's another show, whole nother show. But excellent.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how, the effects of media is literally having an effect on what's getting spoken about in Congress. And I know you wanted to ask both of our guests tonight just what are some of the issues as you see them from your vantage point as a person in media. What are some of the sort of biggest issues facing not only our city leaders, we're in a new mayoral administration, we're in a new governorship, or relatively new governorship, but also we're coming up on a presidential election. So we're interested in hearing from you of some of those political issues and how are those challenges sort of distinct from each other?
Yeah, and let's start with city. What's the big challenge here in Philadelphia?
I think coming from a media perspective, something that, like, when I'm, busy with my job, that I definitely struggle with is we have so many narratives about how to address crime in Philadelphia and to how to address public safety in Philadelphia that are not evidence-based, and that don't actually connect people to more resources, and do not actually speak to the root causes, to Amadi's point earlier. So I think that one of the big challenges for political leaders in the city is like having to appease or aspire to really a stereotypical picture of what people think works that is really deeply rooted in punishment, that is not actually an evidence-based practice. We need political leaders who have the courage to embrace evidence-based practices around what's happening. And I think that that's a really big challenge right now because, like I said, there's a lot of appeasement to what people think might work.
Amadi?
I think how poverty is covered is an ongoing issue in this city, but I would say all the way, state level and national level as well. And really the root causes of poverty, I still see the narrative out there that, poverty is the fault of the impoverished, versus the, structural racism, structural inequality that is historic. And again, I think to Cassie's point, having that narrative continue to be dominant blurs our vision about what can be done to change the situation and how to actually alleviate poverty. So when you have these dominant narratives, it does obscure what the real answers are. And it obscures us having an analysis that actually can get at the solutions. So, there is the best kept secret in the United States is that there's huge swaths of this country and this, this city, of course, but this country that are living hand to mouth every day. People don't talk about it. Politicians rarely talk about people living in poverty. They talk about working class people. They talk about the middle class a lot. They don't talk about people who are living at the lowest rungs of society economically. And the fact that, when the presidential race is coming up, when President Biden is wondering why he may be losing support or people aren't feeling the gains of his economic policies, that's because there's lots of people who are not feeling those effects. And those are the same people who aren't engaged politically because they're disillusioned with the system. So, again, these narratives reinforce, the political status quo that we have. And so I'm concerned about that. And also the fact that the billionaire class is not paying its fair share and that we shouldn't have a billionaire class. These are things that are not discussed enough, in my opinion, both at this city level, as well as at the state and national level.
Powerful. Racialized poverty here in Philadelphia, where we're looking at 11 to 12% of people living in deep poverty, about 185, 200,000 people in the city of Philadelphia, making half the poverty level, somewhere near $7,000 or $8,000 a year, $7,000 or $8,000 a year, $120 roughly, $130 a week. Rent, clothes, food, life itself, health, $120 a week, impossible. Yet it's happening every day in the city of Philadelphia, and we don't talk about it. We don't address it.
Or certainly don't address how it impacts things like crime. We certainly don't want to address that because it's more profitable to increase the budget for police, the never-ending increases that we see. There's never enough money for that, but of course there's always more money for police and courts and prisons and things like that, as opposed to schools and recreation and public health and things like that. So
Yes, we would do better to all the money we're spending extra on policing. We would do better to take that money and give it directly to poor people. That would make us safer. That would make them more healthy. That would give them a greater opportunity of life. And that would help us all enjoy the fruits and the benefits of what they can give us. Just take all that money and just give it to the 11, 12%, 185, 200,000 people who are living in deep poverty now. Just give it to them, and we would do better. You know, but to talk about these narratives are turning the apple cart over of these systems that are in place that are simply poverty pimps. They are making profit off of poor people's misery. And instead of lifting them up, they're making money off of them and keeping them in the same spot. I think the conditions of the city of Philadelphia over the last 50, 60 years, for most people, is exactly the same or worse than it was 60 years ago. And people are looking at that and saying, government can't do anything for me. And then we ask them to vote and only 13%, 11% show up. And we say, what's wrong with them? What you mean what's wrong with them? What's wrong with us? We have not changed their lives through the systems that we have put in place. So they're saying, why do I vote? And then they look and see their president come to this city to get those votes and say, I put money in your pocket, but you didn't change their lives. So it is those stories, those media stories I like to see told. I like to see why. There's some practical reasons why people are doing what they're doing because we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Well, you definitely said a lot. We are getting ready to close, and we can talk and talk in great detail about any of the questions that we had tonight. I mean, any of these questions can be their own show. And so this is really just meant to give like a taste of an overlay of some of the issues. But I do want to end on a hopeful note. You are still both in media, and so, despite all of the challenges, I imagine that you see some spaces and opportunities for hope and change. And so I just would like for you to share some of that, some of the things that make you hopeful about how the media landscape is shifting and changing. And so if you could share, that'd be great.
I'm definitely hopeful about the work that the public safety coverage cohort that Free Press has been facilitating, how that's going.
Tell us about that. Yeah,
it's a collective of Black and brown folks who are interested in either creating or supporting or already have news and information projects that center community, that are led by community, and that are not aspiring to repeat the practices of mainstream media around how these narratives are told. And we just concluded a 2-workshop series around actually imagining what it could be like to bridge the worlds between media and harm reduction, and what do media harm reduction principles and practice look like. And I think for me, those are things that make me feel really hopeful because, there is a mandate, I think, that we have if we're dreaming of different worlds to actually dream of some of the different practices and standards that will hold us in those new worlds that we're trying to journey towards.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much. Amadi?
What am I hopeful about?
You're working hard on this one? You're working hard?
I'm hopeful about, some of the things that I'm hearing Cassie talk about, and that I know we're doing at WURD. I'm excited about the growing independent media landscape that is out there, with people really trying new things, trying to have different standards, better standards, trying to have community voice involved in media, places like Scribe Video Center, places like Philly Cam. All of that is really creating a diverse and rich landscape, and creating free sources of information that people can access to find out about relevant information to their lives. And my hope is that a couple weeks ago, I had on a group of librarians who are working on trying to get libraries back in our public schools. And, we need more media literacy education for our children, so that they can really figure out, where is a good place to get the information that they need to grow and become critical thinkers and self-governing people. So I want to give a shout out to all the librarians out there who are doing that important work in educating our kids.
Absolutely. And did you have something you wanted to say, Cassie?
No, I just snaps to librarians.
That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly hopeful. Maybe not as much about the entities themselves, but the ways in which communities are using media tools to free ourselves. So, for instance, I can think of my background is in criminal defense, and so I'm thinking of participatory defense in the city, and the participatory defense groups, where it's community people working to educate people about how the criminal legal system works, but also working to provide support for people who are going through the criminal legal system. But one of the cool things that they've done is that they've been able to produce mitigation videos to assist people with getting a lesser sentence. And so using the power of the media and the power of narrative to literally change outcomes has been something that has been really, really incredible to see, and to change hearts and minds. And particularly in my field, we work with the press all the time to highlight the stories, and we've seen some success with that. And so I'm encouraged that people are writing about these things and writing about this work. But I know we are running out of time. So I just want to thank the both of you for really coming through and educating us, and providing that deep historical background, and just giving us so much of rich information that I'm sure our viewers will take with them. So I'm just so grateful for the education you provided through this conversation, and I hope it continues as we continue to change the narratives, and to push back against the sensationalization of crime, or the lack of attention to particular stories. Reverend Holston, you want to say something?
Just again, thank you both. Powerful conversation, much learned here today, and Amadi in particular, thank you for allowing us to turn the tables a little bit. I look forward to being on your program again soon. And Cassie, I learned so much from you. I want to get more with that cohort to learn even more. So it's great. Our audience, I believe that it was a wonderful show today. We thank you for your participation in watching this program, and be with us again next month as we celebrate and look at issues of justice on this Just Nation program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.